Hi, welcome back. In this video, we'll begin the process of understanding what Aperture actually does to our shots visually. Now, this has mainly got to do with blurring of the background, as we'll soon see, which is a very important concept in photography. Now, in order to understand this, you have to first of all understand a term called as depth of field. Now, depth of field may sound like a very scary optical term, but it's really not. It's a very easy concept to understand in photography. But once you understand this concept, you'll exactly know how to blur backgrounds in your shot or do the opposite. That is, keep everything sharp in your shot. So in order to understand the concept of depth of field, let's take a closer look and see how depth of field works. So in order to understand what depth of field is and how it works, we'll be looking at a series of images that will make it very clear to you. So the first shot that we're going to look at is this shot that you're seeing in front of you with Batman, a figure of Batman in the foreground and a couple of books in the background. Now what you can see in this shot is that Batman here is very sharp and the books behind appear to be very blurred. So how everything works in photography on a general basis is that when you take a shot, we've already seen that we place our focus point on the object. So in this case, I placed my focus point on this figure of Batman when I took this shot, and hence it is the sharpest thing in the shot. So whatever you place your focus point on, that particular object or subject will be the sharpest in your shot. And as things move away from that subject, things will start to lose sharpness and they will start to go out of focus. That's what happens on a general basis, and that is exactly what is happening here. So if you were to look at a diagram of this particular shot, I've just represented this area and focus that we're talking about using this blue gradient. So what this gradient means is that the darker blue parts represent that area which is completely in focus, which is very sharp. And as this blue color drifts slightly into a lighter blue as we're moving upwards, that means those things which are inside this part will also be sharp, but not as sharp as the dark blue ones. And the things in white are very much out of focus, right? So this area of focus that we're referring to is what is depth of field. That's exactly what depth of field means. What are the things that are in focus, right? So we're going to be seeing how this depth of field can be changed just very soon. But just to repeat myself, depth of field is nothing but the total area in focus when you take a shot, or the total area in acceptable focus when you take a shot, right? So for example, in this shot, we can say that this particular part, the books, are really not a part of the depth of field, or they're out of the area of focus. And this depth of field will originate, or you can think of it like this, that the epicenter of this depth of field or this area in focus will be the point where you place your focus point when you take the shot. So that's gonna start the whole thing, and as things move away from this point, they will start to go slightly out of focus, right? So let's look at one more shot. Now the framing or the composition of the shot is exactly the same, but if you see this time the figure of Batman is blurred and the books behind are sharp. That's because for this shot I actually placed the focus point on the books itself. And this time what has happened is, if you look at the diagram, the opposite has happened. Because we placed the focus point here, the depth of field is around here. And this part is the sharpest, and as things move away, things start to go out of focus. So this figure of Batman in this case is out of focus, just like we can see here. Now, the interesting thing is that how large or small this depth of field or this area in focus is determined by the f-stop number that we're using. So this doesn't always have to be of some particular fixed size, the amount of area in focus. We can actually change it. We can either get the whole scene also in focus, or we can keep a very short area in focus right around the focus point. So this is completely in the hands of the photographer, and it depends on the f-stop number that we're using. So let's see how this works. For example, if I'm using a small f-stop number, like let's say f3.5, what's going to happen is that this depth of field will be very shallow or very small. So, and as I increase the f-stop number, this depth of field will become deeper. That means more amount of area will be in focus in a shot.
And as you raise it further, let's say I go all the way to f22. Now, almost the entire scene that you're shooting will be in acceptable focus. So the depth of field will be very, very deep. So for example, this type of depth of field is used in landscape shots because we want everything to be sharp in a landscape shot. That's why landscape shots are shot at higher f-stop numbers like f16, f13, f22. And this type of a depth of field, which is referred to as a shallow depth of field with small f-stop numbers, is used when you're looking to blur the background or the foreground. So you just want to keep that particular part in focus where you're focusing or where your focus point is when you're taking a shot, but you want anything away from it totally blurred. So I'll be showing you some shots also that will make you understand. But right now what you just have to understand is that this is a very simple and direct relationship of depth of field with the f-stop number. That means if you increase the f-stop number, you raise the depth of field or you make it deeper. And if you decrease the f-stop number, you make it shallower. So only that area will be in focus where you're placing the focus point. And in this case, if you're using a big f-stop number, everything will be in focus. So we'll be seeing some examples also to make this clear. For example, this first shot that we actually saw was at f3.5. So I took this shot at f3.5. And what's happening here is, because I'm using a small f-stop number, so the depth of field is very shallow and it's only around the figure of Batman because that's where I placed my focus point. And that's where the books are out of focus. So this shot is an example of a shot with a shallow depth of field. That's why the background is blur. And this is happening because I'm using a small f-stop number. Now let's see what happens when I increase the f-stop number. So in the next shot here, I've taken this shot at f8. That means I've raised my f-stop number. So what's going to happen? The depth of field will become deeper. So you can see now this shot, if I just go back to the shot, just notice the books here and compare it to the shot with f3.5. So just take a few seconds to note the books are still blurred, but just compare it with the f3.5 shot. They're not as blurred. Can you see this f3.5 shot is way more blur than this shot. You can start to read the titles of the books. It's becoming clearer. Why? Because our depth of field or the area in focus is reaching the books now. So the books are starting to just get in focus. Now let's see what happens when I take a shot at f22. Now this time what is happening is our depth of field is very, very deep and the entire scene is almost in focus. That's why if you look at the books here, they're completely sharp and you can read the titles and everything because they are in focus. So just compare this shot with this shot, which was f8, something in between, and this where it's very blurred. So it's a very, very simple and straightforward relationship to understand. So just to repeat myself, at small f-stop numbers, we get a shallow depth of field. That is, the area in focus is only restricted around the place where we placed our focus point. In this case, that's Batman. So of course, the books will be out of focus. And at f22, we get what we call as a deep depth of field. That means everything will be in focus in a shot. Right? So let's take a few examples. For example, this particular portrait that we're looking at, can you guess whether this uses a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? So if you answered shallow depth of field, you're correct. And let me ask you this question in another way. Have I used a small f-stop number here or have I used a large f-stop number here? I'll give you a few seconds to think. Well, if you answered a small f-stop number, then you're correct. So the f-stop number that I've used in this particular shot is f2.8. Now, one thing that you have to understand is, which we'll be learning in the next video, is that every lens has a different minimum f-stop number that it can go to. For example, your kit lens, as we'll soon be seeing, can go to f3.5, not below that. But the lens that I'm using here is a slightly more expensive lens. Right now, let's just call it that. Later on, we'll be looking exactly what this lens is. But basically, this expensive lens allows me to go to f2.8. And I've taken this shot at f2.8. So I've got a nice blurred background. The lower the f-stop number you can go to, usually it's better because it gives you a more blurred background. Like we'll be seeing also in one of the portrait exercises in this section that I'll be showing you with a a prime lens. A prime lens allows you to basically use a very, very small f-stop number, as we'll be seeing in that video. But right now, don't worry about what a prime lens is or how it works. We'll be seeing it in that video. So this shot is at f2.8, so we've got a shallow depth of field. Now let's look at one more shot just to show you what all you can do with a shallow depth of field. It's not just about isolating your subject and making it look good. You can have some cool effects also because of it. For example, here, I'm just using my kit lens and I've taken this shot at f3.5. Can you guess where have I kept my focus point? So if you answered the flame or the diya, which is this object here, then you're correct. So that's where I place my focus point, and I'm using a small f-stop number of f3.5. Therefore, the lights behind have actually become blurred. And when lights become blurred, they just look very nice because they become all circular like this. The blurred background that we're often referring to in photography, just as a bonus tip for you, is called as bokeh, B-O-K-E-H. And this type of photography, where you have lights in the background, is usually referred to as bokeh effect photography. So you can just go to Google and type bokeh effect and you'll see some very cool looking shots like these. Right, but again, all this is happening because I'm using a small f-stop number. Had I used a bigger f-stop number here, like let's say f16, f22, then all these lights behind would have been very sharp and this shot would not really look good because you would not get this bokeh effect. Now let's look at one more shot. This time things are different. So here, can you guess whether I'm using a small f-stop number or a big f-stop number? So let me show you. If I zoom in to this part, this is sharp. And if I zoom into this part, this is also relatively sharp. So can you try to guess what f-stop number are we using here? So we're using a big f-stop number. Like I told you, in landscape shots, we should normally want the entire scene in focus. So we want our depth of field to be really, really deep. And that's why in this case, I'm using a depth or an f-stop number of f22. So again, you'll be seeing this in the section on landscape that we'll be often using a large f-stop number. Now, this is a shot that we saw in the fast shutter speed section, if you remember, where we had learned how to freeze the movement of something. So there we had seen that I was using a shutter speed of 1/1000 of a second to freeze the movement of these flowers. But this time I'm showing you this shot in terms of aperture. So here I'm using an f-stop of f2.8 to get this blurred background. So you can see how the aperture is doing its own job and how shutter speed is doing its own or producing its own artistic effect. And later on, of course, we'll be seeing a lot of shots like these where shutter speed and aperture are doing their own things. Now let's look at this shot, which is a typical food photography shot. Now in food photography, a shallow depth of field is very, very important because what we normally like to do in food photography is we want the main food item to be sharp in focus, and we want something like an ingredient or something related to the food item kept behind it and which is not in focus. So we want to blur that. So since these two things are kept very close, you require a very, very shallow depth of field. And f3.5 from your kit lens may not be able to give you that depth of field. So usually we use lenses which allow us to use a very small f-stop number. So for example, here I'm using a lens which allows me to go up till f1.8. So here I'm using an f-stop number of f1.8 to take this shot. And you can see that even though the ingredient is pretty close to this glass, the leaves and the lemon behind, but I've still been able to blur it effectively using this small f-stop number. Sometimes you can use a shallow depth of field for just some artistic looking street shots. For example, here I've actually blurred the background deliberately because the monk behind, I just want to be subtle about it. So I just want you to get this feeling that there's a monk who's just inside this room and going on about his prayer routine, but I don't want it to be too clear. So sometimes you can just have these abstract or street shots and you can incorporate this blur to give this artistic effect and convey the message that you want. So just once again to sum things up, here are two shots. For the last time, I just want you to guess which is at a larger f-stop number and which is at a small f-stop number. So now it'll be very, very easy for you. So, of course, the shot on the right is at a small f-stop number. So I've taken this shot at f2.8 and I've just taken the same shot. Everything has remained the same. She's not moved from her position, and I've just simply increased the f-stop number and I've gone all the way to f22. And you can see that this time it has resulted in a sharper background, as you can see on the picture on the left. Now, of course, we'll actually be doing this exercise very soon in this section. So we'll be taking a shot with a shallow depth of field and with a deep depth of field so that you exactly know what settings to use and how to go about when it comes to taking these shots. Right now, if you've just understood what is the relationship between depth of field and the f-stop number. That is, a shallow depth of field results from a small f-stop number and a deep depth of field results from a larger f-stop number. If you've understood that, we're good to move forward.
That's great. So now you understand what depth of field is. You also know what is the relationship between depth of field and the f-stop number. So we have seen that if you use a small f-stop number, you get a shallow depth of field, which is essential in blurring the background. And if you use a larger f-stop number, you get a deeper depth of field and you'll have everything in focus. Now that we know all this, we're in the perfect position to do a simple live exercise to see how all this works. So I'll see you in the next video.